So, have you ever thought about some common mistakes that maybe you should avoid or mistakes that new writers should avoid? Writing is an exciting and creative journey, but for new writers, it can also be fraught with pitfalls. While mistakes are part of the learning process, being aware of common ones can help you navigate the early stages of your writing career with greater confidence. Here's a guide to some frequent missteps that new writers make and how you can avoid them. This is part of learning what not to do by learning about other people's mistakes. All right, number one, failing to plan or over planning. The problem: some writers dive into their projects without a clear idea of where the story is headed, leading to aimless plots. Others spend so much time outlining that they never get to the actual writing of their story. Now, this gets into the two ways you can write a story, and that is the pantser and the plotter. I don't like the term pantser, so if you can come up with a better one, I would love to know. But this person does not do an outline. They let the characters tell the story. This person does a detailed outline. They know everything before they even begin. They know everything that's going to happen before they even write down the first word of the actual story. And here's the thing. I'm somebody who doesn't write an outline, or not much of one. And I think it leads to more authentic stories. If you do this one wrong, it can feel like there's too much author in the story. But you can overdo it. You can fail to do it. You can let your characters go off in too many directions, and you can spend so much time outlining that you never write a single word of your story. So how do you avoid it? You need to find a balance between planning and spontaneity. You can use a loose outline to guide your story while leaving plenty of room for creativity. If you're a discovery writer, a pantser, make periodic notes to keep track of plot threads and character development. What I like to do is write a sentence, and then I write a paragraph that expands on the sentence, and that's usually where I leave it. If I end up with a lot of characters, sometimes I'll create a list of character names and what they do, and that's usually about all I ever do for a book. Number two, the writer ignores basic grammar and style. If you've ever heard there are no rules in fiction, this is only true up to a point. You have to have some sort of baseline. So the problem is poor grammar, awkward sentence structures, or inconsistent style can distract readers and weaken your credibility as a writer. So how do you avoid it? Brush up on grammar basics using resources like the Element of Style. And there are some other ones. You can actually buy just a plain grammar book and read it. Use tools like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid. I don't like Pro Writing Aid. But don't rely on them entirely. You can read more books so that you can internalize how skilled authors use language effectively. Here's the thing about grammar and style in a fiction book. You have to be true to what you have written. So if you start off using a certain style or a certain punctuation method or certain speech patterns. You need to stay consistent throughout the book. You know, the true phrase, there are no rules in fiction writing. What it is there are no rules in fiction writing other than the rules that you set up for your book. So stay true to your book and what you have written. Don't change it up in the middle, or your readers will get irritated with you very quickly. So, number 3. Most writers get caught up in writing perfect or one-dimensional characters. The problem: characters who are flawless or overly stereotypical often fail to engage readers. They lack depth and relatability. How to avoid it? Give your characters strengths and weaknesses. Develop their backstories, motivations, and unique quirks. Show growth by putting them in situations where they must change or make difficult choices. The truth is that if your main character is like the perfect cheerleader and she doesn't do anything wrong ever in your story, it's not going to be very engaging. Giving her, a tormented background for why she must strive to be so perfect helps give the character depth. Likewise, she should make a few mistakes too, because we all make mistakes. And mistakes are what make us human. Mistakes are also what make your characters relatable. Number 4, many authors make the mistake of rushing the beginning, or they start it wrong. So the problem is that an author may start the story with a lengthy backstory, or they might dive straight into the action without context, and this can confuse or alienate readers. Here's the thing. I one time started a book that was absolutely excellent. Absolutely excellent. The first 5 pages were probably the best thing I'd ever read in years. And the premise of the story was that vampires were being tortured by Nazis in order to further their immortal experiments, the eternal life thing. And Nazis were big on these really awful experiments that were meant to purify the race and extend the human life and all this other stuff. So it was perfectly believable to have this in the story, like they had caught some vampires and were now experimenting on them. It was excellent. And 5 pages after that, we've got the main vampire character pining over his lost love 200 years later that he was separated from because of the Nazi experiments. Everything after the first 5 pages was terrible. They should have stuck with the first part of the story. So when your backstory is more interesting than your story, you have a problem. And the other thing is diving straight into the action without any context. And I've seen a lot of stories do this. They plunk you down right in the middle of a battle. Here's the deal. You get about 2 sentences of the battle and you better start explaining it. Because why are they fighting? So you can't do that either. And I don't recommend it. And the reason they do it is because what they tell new writers is that you have to hook your writer or your reader with your very first word or your very first sentence. So obviously they think that dropping somebody in the middle of a battle sequence is going to do it. Yeah, except you didn't answer the who, what, when, where, or why of anything. Here's the battle. So how do you avoid it? Open with a hook that intrigues readers and introduces the main character or conflict. Weave in the backstory gradually as it becomes relevant. Make sure your opening scene sets the tone for the rest of the story. And don't forget who, what, when, where, and why. You need to have this pretty close to the beginning of the story. And this is how you write. You're supposed to write news articles too. Is you're supposed to put in your who, what, when, where, and why at the top, and then the rest of the story gets more into the details of it. You need to look at your novel the same way. Get your who, what, when, where, and why in that first paragraph. If not, definitely on the first chapter. All right, number 5. Sometimes beginning authors overload with description or dialogue. The problem: excessive description can slow the pacing, while too much dialogue can make the story feel static. Here's the deal: excessive description can absolutely slow the pacing, because every time you stop to describe something, you are also stopping the story. If your characters keep repeating the same dialogue, you can make your story feel static. Like if your characters keep talking about the engines instead of like working through the problem, it can feel static. So how do you avoid it? So how to avoid it? Try and balance the action, the dialogue, and the description. Ensure descriptions are vivid but concise. Focus on sensory details that enhance the scene. And here's the other thing: only describe things that are important. If the chair that your character is sitting in is not important, then just have them sit in the chair. If the computer is important, then describe it in detail. But don't sit and try and describe everything. Only describe the things that are important to the story. Next, try and write dialogue that sounds natural and serves a purpose, revealing characters, advancing the plot, or building tension. Don't write, like, you don't need to put in niceties in every dialogue. You might do that once when characters meet, like, oh, hi, how are you? Hey, my name is blah, blah, blah. Don't do it every time the characters come in contact. You only need to do it once, if at all. Number 6, neglecting conflict and stakes. So, in order for stories to be intriguing, they must have conflict. And I actually had a problem with this when I first started writing. I just didn't have enough conflict in my story. Everybody got along perfectly, and it was a problem. So, without conflict, stories lack tension and they fail to engage readers. How do you avoid it? Introduce meaningful conflict early on, whether it's internal or external. Raise the stakes by showing what the characters have to lose or gain, and ensure conflicts escalate, keeping readers invested in the outcome. In other words, don't write around a conflict. If your characters are going to get into an argument, let them get into an argument, and then let them get themselves out of the argument if they can. Number 7, focusing too much on roles or rules. Focusing too much on rules. The problem: new writers often get bogged down by trying to follow every piece of writing advice they've heard, and it stifles their creativity. Here's the deal: you need to know all the rules to write fiction. Read them, know what they are, commit them to memory if you want to, and then throw them all out the window. Because great fiction doesn't need those rules. You can also experiment with style and voice to find out what works for you. And most importantly, trust your instincts and embrace your unique approach to storytelling. Just because somebody says never do this or never do that thing doesn't mean that that thing that you're never supposed to do isn't perfect for the story that you're writing. So, there is that. Number 8, some writers absolutely are terrified of revisions. Some writers resist revising their work, thinking that the first draft should be perfect. Others over-edit, endlessly tweaking without ever finishing. And here's what happens. These guys that resist revising their work, they're stuck on chapter 1, paragraph 1, because their first paragraph isn't perfect yet and they can't move on. The over-editors have done 25 drafts of the whole book and it's still not perfect. Neither one of these things is going to help you finish a book or get it published. So here's the deal. Accept that the first draft is only the beginning, and writing, the bulk of your story, will appear in the rewriting phases. Take breaks between drafts to gain perspective on your story. 3. Set clear goals for each editing round. Usually structural changes first, then line edits, then proofreading. I had someone who did this and this at the same time. Oops. I don't know how that worked out for him, but that's what they did. Number 9. New writers sometimes overload the reader with information. The problem, info dumps, especially in world building or backstory, can overwhelm readers and slow the story's pace. Drop this stuff in as you go. Introduce the information gradually through context, dialogue, or action. Focus on what's essential for the scene or character development, and trust your readers to pick up on the subtleties without over-explaining. Here's the deal. In most of my books, you have no idea what anything looks like in the first chapter. But as the book goes on, you'll know what the characters look like. You'll know what the house looks like. You'll have a complete setting. But I tend to spread that stuff out through the whole book. I don't drop anything hardly ever as far as description goes. I don't like info dumps, and I typically don't do them. That's not to say you couldn't find one in one of my books. I'm sure you can. Number 10. Sometimes writers don't read enough. The problem, writers who don't read widely may struggle to understand genre, conventions, storytelling techniques, or audience expectations. And here's the question I pose to you. What is the last thing you read, and when did you read it? You don't need to read obsessively, but you need to stay up to date. I once read a book from an author, and I thought it was great. The problem was that they didn't keep up with punctuation, the new punctuation. And it'll really irk you, when you first have to do something different, that you've always done something different. And it just had so much punctuation in it. It was... And it was everything. You can envision words in this, and it was awful. Just so much punctuation in it. And that was the problem with the whole story. The story itself was great, but it had so much punctuation in it that it was distracting. Because these days we do minimal punctuation. We don't even do the 2 spaces after the period anymore. It's just 1. But they didn't pick up on that. And they still used the old style. And it got them dinged hardcore in the reviews. People hated it, and it wasn't the story. It was this. So how do you avoid this problem? Read extensively in your chosen genre to understand what works and what doesn't. Explore other genres to broaden your perspective and inspire creativity. Analyze what you read, observe how authors structure their stories, create characters, and build tension. And you don't need to read all the time, because here's the thing. Don't get so caught up in reading that you forget to write your own story. And then again, if it's only been a few years since you've read your last book, you probably don't need to read one today, unless you want to. But remember to read occasionally. Pick up a book and read it. It'll help you out. 11. New writers often compare themselves to other writers. Don't do it. The problem, constantly measuring your progress or style against others can lead to discouragement and self-doubt. How to avoid it? Focus on your growth and unique voice rather than comparing yourself to established authors. Don't try to be the next Stephen King. Don't try to be the next Anne Rice. Be the next you. Remember, every writer's journey is different. Use other writers' success as inspiration, not a benchmark to judge your worth. 12. Lots of writers fall into this. I think it's 99% of writers who start a book don't finish it. So, not finishing projects. Many new writers start multiple stories but never see them through till the end. How to avoid it. Commitment to finishing your current project before starting something new can help you out. And here's the thing, if you have an idea for a new story, you can write it down and save it, and then go back to the story you're working on. Set realistic deadlines to keep yourself accountable, and remind yourself that completed work, even imperfect, is still better than unfinished ideas. Final thoughts. Mistakes are a natural part of the writing process and can be valuable learning experiences. By recognizing and addressing these common pitfalls, you can focus on developing your craft and producing work you're proud of. Remember, writing is the journey, not the destination. Embrace your growth as a writer. Celebrate your progress. And most importantly, keep writing. You will get there. Anyway, thank you for listening to this tutorial. I hope it helped you. If you are so motivated, please like and subscribe, and I will talk to you later.